My name is Tom Carpenter. I'm the executive director of an organization called Hanford Challenge. Hanford Challenge oversees the cleanup at the Hanford nuclear site. Hanford used to make plutonium for the nuclear arsenal. It started in World War II, and it ran 9 production reactors, and some other reactors for research and much similar missions like that, up until the mid-1980s. It produced an estimated 70 metric tons of plutonium. Plutonium didn't really exist in nature prior to World War II, when it was discovered and isolated by Manhattan Project scientists who were looking for a way to harness the energy of the atom to make weapons. And they did that, of course. And the place to make that happen was the Hanford nuclear site. It's one of the main facilities for both the production of the first plutonium that was used in the first nuclear explosion in the desert in New Mexico, called the Trinity test, and then in the Nagasaki bomb that was dropped over Nagasaki on August 9th, 1945. Hanford went on to build more reactors and produce spent nuclear fuel and plutonium for the next 45 years in service of the nuclear arsenal and the nuclear buildup, which in today's dollars, the Brookings Institute now has said, they put out a study that's about $8 trillion to make the nuclear arsenal for the United States. So that's a large figure, and keep that in mind when we talk about the cleanup, which we'll talk about a little later. I've been asked to talk about a little bit about what we do, and then about the spent nuclear fuel and whistleblowers and whatnot at Hanford, and I'm happy to answer questions after everyone speaks. Essentially, I got involved first in Hanford in the mid-1980s because whistleblowers came to the organization where I was working, which was then called Government Accountability Project. It's still there. It's a national whistleblower support organization. And I was the head of the nuclear oversight campaign. And the workers who first came forward were very brave because they had to maintain a security clearance out there. There was very much an us versus them mentality in the community, which is still pretty present. But it was quite a risky thing to speak out against the plant in any way, even if it was for increased health and safety or environmental compliance and those kind of things, which the plant had never had to be in compliance with the environmental laws or health and safety laws because of national security. So what we think about when the reactors in the United States were run for commercial purposes, that was under the auspices of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, before that the Atomic Energy Commission. They had at least had some standards that they had to adhere to, especially after 3 Mile Island. And a lot of standards came in. That never really happened at the Department of Energy. So they don't really have a very robust nuclear safety program. They didn't handle their plutonium very safely. They certainly didn't handle their nuclear waste very safely. And as a result, Hanford has become the most contaminated nuclear facility in the United States, and one of the top 10 in the world. And that's really saying something, folks. This is a highly, highly contaminated nuclear facility that is going to be a threat to the environment, to future generations, for the foreseeable future, for as long as we can think about. The reason is that many of these radionuclides are present in extremely large volumes out there that have long half-lives. They cannot be destroyed. They can't be really mitigated except encased in some medium like glass that will last long enough to not be a threat, and that needs to be put probably in a deep geological repository, which is the plan. But that's only going to be a very small portion of the cleanup out there. So how did Hanford work? Well, essentially it had 9 nuclear reactors. and each reactor made spent fuel, and it had what are called target elements that it radiated uranium-238, and that transmuted to plutonium-239. And that fuel was then taken from the reactors and dissolved in these very large reprocessing facilities on the Hanford site. They had 5 of them built out there, and those facilities dissolved the spent nuclear fuel in acid and then used chemicals to separate out the plutonium, the very tiny portions of plutonium present in that fuel. And as a result was all the nuclear waste that's now stored in underground nuclear waste tanks, or in the desert, or in trenches, or basically in the groundwater, because Hanford is famous for using its environment, its soil and its water, as storage media for nuclear waste and for chemicals. And that's one of the reasons it's so maddening of a challenge for us to look at and grapple with and try to clean this up. There is still some spent nuclear fuel that was left over when the campaign at Hanford finally stopped in 1986 with the shutdown of the N reactor and the shutdown the next year of the Purex facility, the last operating reprocessing facility. They had a very large inventory of spent nuclear fuel left over in something called the K basins. The K basins are 2 large, just imagine swimming pools about 20 feet deep that contained many metric tons of spent nuclear fuel, and that fuel simply sat in those basins for decades, corroding and falling to pieces. And finally, in the 1990s and 2000 timeframe, they started addressing that. It was considered one of the most vulnerable environmental spots in the entire Department of Energy complex. This was, if something bad was going to happen with very significant impacts to the United States, the Department of Energy identified that K basins, which is only 1,000 yards from the river, those 2 basins as the most likely to cause a very large environmental threat, simply because of the quantity of radionuclides, the condition of the fuel, the fact that these basins were old, that its location was right next to the river, and bad things could happen in there. So because of public outcry, because of the Hanford Advisory Board, because of groups like Heart of America and others, pressure was put on the Department of Energy to address that issue. And in 2004, most of that fuel was removed except for the many tons of sludge left over, and they're still dealing with trying to get that sludge out. We've got a very large challenge ahead of us because of also the tanks out there that have been in the newspaper recently. 177 tanks, 67 have already leaked. Now we're looking at an additional as many as 21 tanks leaking, including for the first time a double shell tank, which was supposed to last essentially through the life of the cleanup for another 40 or 50 years. This kind of hit the news by storm. After an intern, we heard, did some calculations and found that, gee, if you look at the long-term history of some of these tank leaks, you show a fairly substantial drop in the liquid level of waste in a lot of these tanks. Bingo, they're leaking. And again, we heard that an intern found this out. This was then announced to the governor, the new governor of the state of Washington, Inslee, Jay Inslee, who essentially took a different turn than our previous governor. When she heard about the double shell tank leaking, there wasn't much response. But when Jay Inslee heard about this, he held a press conference and said there's going to be 0 tolerance for radioactive leaks at Hanford. So that was one tank. They started with one tank, T111. And then DOE said, oh, actually there's 6 tanks leaking. And they said that the next week. And then quietly, the head of the Department of Energy's Office of River Protection said at an Oregon meeting just a week later, oh, yeah, there's another 14 on top of that we think might be leaking as well. They really don't have a good handle on how much has leaked. when it's leaked, where it's going, how fast it's moving, because their technology for measuring these leaks is so poor. One of the confounding factors is they're finding liquids going into the tanks. So somehow water is getting into these tanks and mixing with the waste, and so that could be masking the extent of leaks from these tanks. They just don't know how much is going in. So we're kind of at it just kind of highlights where we are, which is these tanks were never designed to last this long. Most of the tanks, their life ended right around the time that we had a moonshot, right back in the 60s. Their 20-year design life. And here we are in 2013, we really don't have a solution for what to do with all that waste. We're supposed to turn it into glass at this big facility called the waste treatment plant. Whistleblowers have pointed out that there are severe safety issues. It started with one guy, Walt Tamasitis. He was terminated from his job at the waste treatment plant after raising about 50 technical issues about hydrogen gas explosions and nuclear criticalities. Other people followed with disclosures about corrosion cracking in the vessels, larger plutonium particle sizes that could lead to a more likelihood of criticality, and it just piled on. So now you've got like the top technical cadre. The research manager, that was Walt Tamasitis, PhD, 40 years experience, removed from his job. Boom, you're out because you raised these issues, right? And then came along the chief scientist, Don Alexander, for the Department of Energy. He raised a bunch of concerns. And then Donna Bushy came forward. Donna Bushy is the manager of environmental and nuclear safety, and she still is in that job for the waste treatment plant. And others have come forward as well, and memos have leaked out, et cetera. To this point now, the Department of Energy has admitted that they've got severe safety problems with the design, and the plant is essentially on suspension, and they're looking for ways to kind of get around some of the pre-treatment in other areas. But it's been all along, it's been whistleblowers who have brought these issues forward. Even in the 1980s when I first started, it was Casey Root and Ed Bricker and others who blew the whistle on this. And that's our role, is to help those folks get the truth out to the public. So we know what's going on, and then put that truth to work in Congress and any agencies that are willing to listen, and to try to get some systemic changes so that down the road, our children and grandchildren and whatnot will be protected from what Hanford is today and what it will be in the future, and to do what we can. Also, we're faced with some really imminent risks, and my time's up, I know, so I'll just... No? You got it. Really? Okay, well, I don't want to take too much time. So you give me the thumbs up when it's, I'll keep looking at you. How about that? All right, good. How much time do I have? You got 5 minutes. Oh, 5, great. So good. So now I can kind of bring this home to the Columbia Generating Station, which is what you've been hearing about. And the Columbia Generating Station is not on the Hanford site, if you ask them. In fact, man, they were really pissed off when we did a video, or actually as a commercial, of a whistleblower, Matt Taylor, and he started off saying, I've got 2 boys, and anyway, it just was his experience as a whistleblower. And it showed a picture of the Columbia Generating Station as it panned through the site. And we got this phone call from Columbia Generating Station objecting to us showing an image of the Columbia Generating Station on this commercial about a Hanford whistleblower, saying that we're not on Hanford, this isn't Hanford, we demand you take that off. And we just laughed. We said, well, what are you going to do to us, right? I mean, come on, you're on the Hanford site, and then we didn't hear anything more from them. But they're very sensitive. They don't want to get tarred with the Hanford brush, is how they kind of said it, right? And we've got some work to do, because that facility is beyond its design life. The spent nuclear fuel pools are quadruple packed beyond their design. They never were designed to hold this much fuel. And an fundamental engineering principle is you don't use something beyond its design, right? It's the same with the fast flux test facility. You don't run it to become a reactor to make tritium. or medical isotopes. It's not what it was designed for. So if you kind of start using it for different purposes, you have to go through a lot of different analysis and whatnot, and I'm sure they'll say they have done that. However, now you've got, a very dangerous situation with this above-ground nuclear fuel pool that's vulnerable to sabotage, to attack, to an earthquake, to cause a huge accident. All you need to do is drain the water from that pool and wait a couple of hours. It will boil away, and 9% of that cesium you will equal the dose from Chernobyl to a 3-state area. That's what it would take, and obviously no one wants to go there. But no one also, we don't talk about then what would happen, right? Because this could be the granddaddy of nuclear accidents, because now you can't maintain the tank farms, and because no one can get near that place. It's only a few miles away from the tank farms, right? And other areas around the site that need to be maintained, we spend hundreds of millions of dollars a year. And we need to simply babysit, maintain, monitor, measure, and control nuclear risks at Hanford, right? These tanks, 177 tanks, they generate hydrogen gas, and they have to be monitored and controlled. You've got to take the gas out of there. If it builds up and there's an ignition source, then kaboom, right? You don't want that to happen. It's a bad day when that happens. It could affect other tanks. So you would have a very difficult time controlling and keeping the rest of the nuclear issues under control at Hanford, and vice versa. If something happened at Hanford, that could affect whether or not they could control the Columbia Generating Station. And so this is something I never see in any of the EISs or any of the other scenarios that they spin up about, well, what could happen? And we're thinking of the worst case scenario, and I just sit in my office and go, no, that's not it. There's much worse scenarios than what they're talking about. Part of our job is to point that out, to get people energized about this. It's a very depressing subject, so I'm glad you're out here tonight, because it seems hopeless, but it's not. We've come a long way in the 25 years that I've been working on this. Gerry has been at it much longer than I have, and there's some people, John Buchanan too, been at this longer, and we see a lot of changes out there. It's worth doing this work, and mostly we just don't have a choice, right? Once you understand the situation, you cannot put your head in the radioactive sand, as Ron Wyden once famously said. It's going to be there anyway. So thanks very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions, but after the next presentations. Thank you.
Is it okay if I grab one of these microphones? Just flip that switch. All right, while Danny's getting set up, thank you, everybody. Thank you to the hosts who put this together. It's such an honor to sit with 3 of my nuclear heroes up here at the panel. But my big hero who's here today is my mom. And so this is my mom, Marianne, who is from Rhode Island. And as I sit and look at her thinking about some of these issues, I grew up in a community, my dad was a professor at a university, and in our community there was a lot of nuclear protests. It was in Rhode Island, and so people used to go to Groton, Connecticut, and regularly get arrested for locking themselves in protest to the Trident submarines, and my parents were protesting all my life when I was young, and it's just that reminder that you have to teach resistance to each generation, and my mom and dad taught me that, and it passes on, and so I'm grateful. All right. So today I'm talking about a bunch of different things. I'm an anthropologist by training. Yeah, sorry.
We can't call her.
Oh, louder. Okay, I'm sorry. Apologies. Thank you. I'm an anthropologist by training, and nobody has any idea what anthropology is, and we still are trying to figure that out ourselves a little bit, but it's a study of human beings. So I'm going to talk about human beings a little bit because they seem to be absent in the whole discussion of nuclear issues, and in particular looking at how we reinsert human beings into our nuclear policies, because we talk about these things as science, or we talk about them as energy or technology or risk, but what I think about are the human beings behind that, and when they're not a part of the decision making, we're not making adequate decisions that reflect the full impacts of our decisions. And so I want to talk about reinserting people into our energy policies. And just thinking about the picture there with a man who's masked, using technology to read an invisible hazard to a child, looking how scared the mother is, how scared the child is. How is it okay that that's our reality? How do we accept that? And so these are the faces that we need to be seeing when we think about our nuclear policy. So we're reminded of the impacts on ourselves, and so that we have empathy with the people who are experiencing these issues. These are not just problems for people in Fukushima or people in the Tri-Cities, they're problems for all of us, so we need to connect. Looking too at where these ideas of clean energy, that's become one way that I've wanted to examine how human beings get left out of these equations, and how we've come to think about nuclear energy as this clean energy source, and that word keeps getting used by the industry over and over, again because we can't see it, we can't smell it, you don't see that radiation, so it's the idea, it's the answer to global warming because it's not dirty like coal, it's clean for our environment, and as we're going to look with a few images, obviously it's anything but clean for the people who live with the risks and the burdens associated with the nuclear energy. So thinking about that idea of clean and cleanliness and how we sanitize so many of our ideas about nuclear energy, I went to Energy Northwest's website to look at the way that they talk about nuclear power in Washington State and how they're talking about the Columbia Generating Station. And again, this idea of the absence of human beings certainly came out. They talked about uranium being the naturally occurring element as the primary fuel source. So it makes it seem like, oh, it's natural, like the daisies that come up in the ground or the trees that are growing. Uranium's perfectly natural. And so there's no discussion. To the left there is a picture of uranium miners in Africa, and thinking about the immense hazards that they go through. Africa provided, I think I've seen estimates of like 1/5 to 1/2 of all the uranium to the United States during the Cold War. And so we don't think about those long-term international impacts. And so there are a couple of themes, I think, that keep coming out. I like Tom's theme about how we think about nuclear and we think about temporary fixes, but then we get very lulled by the temporary and they become the permanent. There's a complacency that sort of settles in, and so what is temporary has become permanent, and we've allowed that to happen, and so there's that need to resist, I think, very much. There's also, I think, the need to think that no nuclear decision is local, and we certainly saw that with Fukushima and other issues, that it's never contained to a locality. So when we think about a Hanford issue, we have to think about Africa and thinking about the Navajo and thinking where the uranium comes from. And then we have to think about all the places the plutonium went to the Marshall Islands, to Japan and beyond. And then seeing this full network rather than thinking in isolation, because these issues are so complex and so expensive, we need each other. We need to think globally in a response here. So move on, please. So nuclear technology, the way it's talked about, and certainly on that previous slide by Energy Northwest, it's always talked about as this controllable science. And in that last slide, there had been a little blurb about, our plant operators will safely shut it down if there's any problem. It's, it's again that idea of ease, of don't worry, we've got this. It's under perfect control. And so we have this great faith in our technology and our science, and we think of it in many ways as flawless, because it certainly can be miraculous. I think if you're a cancer patient and you get a chemotherapy treatment and radiation can cure your cancer, you could think about it as this wonderful, miraculous substance. But we can't think about it as a flawless substance, certainly. And so our nuclear power and our nuclear energy, we think about perfect technology, but obviously they're human beings who are operating these systems, and human beings, as we all know, are subject to failure. And so we can't have a premise where we're operating needing perfection and then have human beings involved in the mix, because we're imperfect creatures, obviously. Back to this idea of radiation not knowing any boundaries, and this is something I keep coming back to, and certainly I've worked in the Marshall Islands for about, 25, 26 years or something now. And thinking about the connections, we often think about, our oceans as separating peoples, like, they live on the other side of the Pacific Rim, or we think about them as distant locations, but actually the ocean is the unifier. It's what brings us together, and the natural environment really does that. It connects us, our shared air, our shared earth, our shared water. These are all resources that pull human beings together. They don't divide us. And so we have to look where our common stakes are impacted in our common world. And so, if we think about the Pacific Ocean, for instance, and think about, the previous speaker was showing how the Columbia River and the importance of that through Hanford. And so if radiation becomes a larger issue for the Columbia and eventually moves into the Pacific, well, that's not just a problem for us. It certainly is a big problem for us in Washington State, but then that becomes a problem for all of our global neighbors who share the Pacific Ocean. Similarly, what happens out in Japan or happens in the Marshall Islands affects us too, because we're sharing those same waterways. And so we need to be thinking together. Over to the right there is a picture of a nuclear waste storage facility that was temporary, going back to Tom's theme, in the Marshall Islands. After one of the detonations from this is a crater that was left by one of the nuclear detonations in the Marshall Islands. There was an identical crater that was here in the land from a different detonation. And to clean up that island in the Marshall Islands, the US government scraped all the topsoil that was full of plutonium and scraped it into the crater and then mixed it up with cement and left it there in the 1970s. And that was meant to be a temporary facility. And it, like we've been hearing in terms of the tanks in Hanford, it remains. And so if we look at sort of the promises of the United States and look at the track record in terms of how we're doing on nuclear waste containment and storage, how we're doing on health issues, we start to see some themes here. This was meant to be a temporary facility, and now with concerns about sea level rise and climate change, that facility is in the verge of falling into the Pacific Ocean. It's full of plutonium with a half-life of 24,000 years. So if that goes into the Pacific Ocean, obviously it's an issue of concern for the Marshallese who live there, but it's also a concern for everybody who shares the Pacific. That's where US tuna fleets are located. And so I guess we just need to be thinking about radiation in terms of its shared aspects, because radiation, as we know again from Fukushima and other events, it doesn't stay in the country where it comes from. And so, if we make nuclear decisions about the Columbia generating state that the Columbia generating station that benefit Washington's economy or give us our energy that we need, we're making those decisions for ourselves, for Washington State. But should there be a risk or should there be a hazard, it's not just borne by us. Radiation knows no boundaries intergenerationally. So maybe our generation gets all the current economic benefits or from the energy, but then we're strapping multiple generations with all the burdens of the waste. Like, do we have that ethical or moral ability to make decisions to say, we're going to benefit in our economy now from this use of energy, but here's 24,000 plus years of waste to you future generations. And so our energy use is so short, it's so quick, and it's amazing that we have justified somehow the ability to burden other generations with that. And so the radiation, it travels across legal boundaries, it travels across linguistic boundaries, boundaries of race, boundaries of gender, boundaries of religion. It travels everywhere. It is the ultimate connector, I think. And as we make these long-term decisions, thinking again about the longevity, particularly in terms of our energy, when we're thinking about short-term benefits and very, very, very long-term risks involved. There are a couple of signs there on the left that show the signage that exists on current nuclear sites. The one on the top is off of that dome on the Marshall Islands that I showed. And it really says, this island is really dangerous, don't come to it. And the translation is, danger, keep off. And when we think about how long this plutonium is around, if we think 24,000 years, and then we think, how do we even warn future generations about this? On the right is an example of Old English from 1,200 years ago, and we look at how much the English language has changed. So we can't even understand what our own language was 1,200 years ago. How on earth do we then make caution signs for future generations that can last 24,000 years for an invisible substance that they can't see, that has leaked under the ground out of tanks that we can't even find? And so I think it calls on sort of those moral imperatives for us.
Could you please read the Old English? Yeah.
Oh, yeah. If I could, I would love to. Yes, I'm sorry I can't there. So,
don't worry, perfectly safe.
yeah, that's right. I think Tom got it perfectly. Thumbs up, it's clean, it's safe, yeah, no problems. And so the nuclear industry tells us over and over again that, again, as Tom just translated perfectly, it's clean, it's safe, there are no risks, there are no hazards, and it's because the risks are invisible to us, because we're not seeing those, and we don't look at pictures of the Marshallese with multi-generational impacts because their DNA has changed, because of the chromosomal abnormalities that are manifesting in future generations. We don't look at those gnarled bodies and look at what radiation has done to human beings. And so it allows us to keep that sanitized image in our minds where radiation is clean, it is safe. But in the Marshall Islands, they know very differently. And when we look at the US track record to say, oh, it's okay, we took care of these people, we met our obligations. What does the US meeting its nuclear obligations look like? It means that nuclear waste facility that's about to fall into the Pacific Ocean that the Marshall Islands now owns because the Marshall Islands is no longer a territory of the United States. So the Marshallese have inherited that burden. In terms of the healthcare, it means a nation that has large amounts of radiation still in the environment there. There's no oncologist provided by the United States. There's no chemotherapy. So if you get cancer in the Marshall Islands, you can't even get the treatment that would keep you alive because it doesn't exist out there. It means there are no medical records that even explain the procedures that people have had. No apologies, no trust, no recognition of the multi-generational impacts. The US still maintains that it's only the people who are alive during the testing program and exposed to radiation from just one of the events that were affected. And so when we have to, I guess, when we're making decisions about, in Washington State, for instance, are we going to use nuclear energy? We have to be aware of the consequences and if you could go forward, please. I think sort of speak back to that narrative that it's clean, it's safe, and it's okay. We're talking a little bit about how to get the next generation and sort of the issues of hope. And so I just wrapped up a class teaching the culture of the bomb to 200 different students. And At the end of the class, you know, we start out, and it's kind of depressing in the beginning as we talk about these topics, and then slowly to the quarter, we talk about what are their talents, what creativities do they have, how do we harness them, how do we get their ideas and their visions of the world injected into these conversations. And the images that they came up with were astounding, and really did leave me hopeful. I put up just a few of them. You know, several played around with Photoshop and made these images. To the left is one of the volleyball players on the UW volleyball team, and she took one of her images of getting excited from one of her games and turned it into anger and frustration over nuclear bombs. Another student from Taiwan put his head on the face of Godzilla and said, "My generation will not become the generation of monsters that indiscriminately destroy cities. I won't allow that." There's a picture there of a tie-dye that a student made. It doesn't do it justice to show the picture, but to say, we care about these issues, we care about what's happened. At the bottom picture there of the cranes, the students learned the story of Sadako, the Japanese girl who succumbed to leukemia after Hiroshima, and she had been folding those paper cranes to make her wish, and she died before she got to the end. So 2 of my students folded all the rest of the paper cranes that she needed in order to make her wish, and then wrote this long wish about their hopes for a nuclear-free future. And so it's when students in the next generation, I think when they learn about these issues and they learn what they're inheriting, because these are intergenerational issues. If we've got elements that have a half-life of 24,000 years, we have to educate every generation. The way my mom educated me, we have to pass that along, because every generation has to get ready for what they're inheriting. And so each generation has to learn anew the risks and the dangers involved. And so now more than ever, there needs to be that renewal, because we can't allow sort of the era of protests, which were around Vietnam and starting around a lot of nuclear protests. We have to find a way for that to continue into the future, because we have to get each generation ready. And this is one of my favorite student images, and I'll leave it with this. So one of my students took photographs of every student in the class and then made a mural out of it of the bomb, and used the quote like, "You're the bomb," which means like you're terrific, you're something big. And he made that message to his classmates to say, you know what, you are the bomb, because you're making the decisions about what happens with the bomb. When we talk about the bomb, we use that word "the" like it's an it, like it's a thing. But it's that reminder that no, it's human beings who make the decisions about how to use them and what we do with our nuclear power. And so he was kind of asserting personal responsibility over these issues in a way that I thought was infinitely creative. And so I'm excited to get that next generation involved. They've got different ideas about social media and creativity and art. We just need to get them prepared and allow them the space to join us. And I think that's about all I had. Oh, well, it goes on.
CGS. We have one picture of the CGS that you might be able to pick up, and just put it on the slide. Thanks a lot, Holly. I'm going to just sit here. People know me, Tom Buchanan, and I'm going to also talk about nuclear, but focus on CGS type spent fuels. And I want to quote some of the words of a Canadian who's an activist, Gordon Edwards, and he's talking about the state of the spent fuel pools in Fukushima right now. And he has 6 kind of conditions. Each pool contains spent fuel from several years of operation. Now, they're actually more efficient about moving their material out of the spent fuel pools than people in the United States. And we've heard various numbers, but at least 10 years of operation of still radioactive spent fuel is, on the average, is in U.S. reactor pools. They're especially dangerous when, if you look again at Fukushima, the pools are above the reactor. And that's, of course, the condition of the Mark Is, the Mark IIs, and the Mark IIIs, the GE-style reactor that ended up going into complete meltdown and still are melting down and radiating from that surface. We have also one storage pool. I say we because it does cross our boundaries and we're affected by it. And if that one goes, that one common pool, spent fuel pool, the others are burned. But if that one goes, that's a real serious impact on the Northern Hemisphere. It's not just Japan. That's the one that lost power along with the other three and for about a day and a half, and we're blaming it on a rat that got burned in a switching panel. And they found, we don't see any pictures of it, but it actually has a burned carcass of this rat. And you think, is this how we're running our industry now? Well, you know, you got to give the people in Japan credit for actually getting the circulating power to those terrible damaged reactors and their spent fuel pools. And they couldn't have much time in there. They had to get in there and put a switching panel in there quickly and get out because they would have had a year's exposure right there. Get out, keep working. Somebody else, sometime else, will go in and check that. Well, maybe they didn't check it. Maybe a rat was able to get in there and gnaw on that insulation. And what are they gnawing on? That insulation is actually sweet. And you know, animals have, and rats in our own homes have chewed into electrical insulation, so why doesn't that happen at the nuclear reactors? I guess it does. I guess it does. Another thing that Edwards talks about is how much, besides the blast of penetrating radiation, they're going to have a lot of trouble with the one reactor, the one spent fuel pool that's in common, that's the one that's propped up right now with extra stability of steel structures underneath. It's kind of like the leaning tower of spent fuel. It's already kind of tilted a little bit because there's so many aftershocks in Japan, and they've seen a tilt as well on the side. So it's underneath. They've got structures that have been rebuilt. That's now covered in plastic to keep the radiation from leaving. They have construction type plastic around the thing. That was lost, but it was only a day and a half, and they had 3 more days before it was really going to heat up. That's what they said. So what I'm saying, and Mr. Edwards is saying, is that it's pretty critical there, but with the storage of the spent fuel that we've got in this country, if any of ours goes, especially the Mark Is and Mark IIs, like the one out at CGS, they have even more inventory than the ones on the average in Japan. In Japan, they have more dry cask storage from the spent fuel pools that we do. And the 6 or 9 dry casks that were on the site in Fukushima all survived. They were dry cask nitrogen gas storage. They all survived. They never were breached by either the tsunami or the earthquake. Of course, the stuff, as we know, the spent fuel pools were in danger. The reactors and the containments were also compromised and leaking. But the thing that's important, I think, and we don't really know the difference between the earthquake damage. It might have, even without a tsunami, those reactors may have been lost because there was a lot of shaking. They lost backup water. They lost backup power. In one case, without the tsunami. Then the tsunami comes in and finishes everything off. They're still claiming that it was the tsunami that did it, and it's at least in one case, it was the earthquake that shut it down, that really damaged things. One more thing in terms of what's happening there right now is, you know, we don't know too much about how this cladding interacts, but the cladding on these reactor rods is encased in zirconium. And zirconium, and the actual thickness of the zirconium rods, there's about, what, 12 to 15 rods in a bundle. So they bring them out, they set them down, they either put them in the spent fuel pool or put the new ones in. And this cladding, once it starts to heat up, starts to flex a little bit. Then maybe it gets a little crud. We've been talking about crud around here. What goes on inside both a reactor and in a spent fuel pool? What's in there that's kind of damaging things? The cladding is only about as thick as a oversized aluminum foil. Oversized, but it's still very, very thin. So then you get higher burn rates, you get storage in spent fuel. This cladding starts to compromise, and it needs something else before it ignites, like a sparkler. That's really what happens. It needs either some exposure to the air and then some hydrogen, but itself, that cladding itself, even if it didn't have hydrogen, would start to fire, would start to sparkle after it got oxidized, and it would start to heat up. It's a very unstable cladding once it's exposed to the air, and then if there's hydrogen around, H2, that stuff is very explosive and it takes off. So in terms of our own temporary storage, the sense of temporary, at the waste site, the Energy Northwest Waste the website, for example, they think that they're putting down on the website that the spent fuel is still going to Yucca Mountain. They don't even talk about the fact that we don't have a temporary, a long-term storage site now. Even in our dreams, we don't have it. So they're just, I mean, you talk about denial. Talk about what happens with people when they're thinking about waste. Just like in the Marshall Islands. You have a spot for it, and it's starting to wash away. The ocean's right up next to it. So you've had this stuff that half the time the inventory is more than half of your production at the site, and it's still in the fuel pool. Arnie talks about this. Arnie Gunderson talks about this because he actually designed new ways of re-racking in the fuel pools to make it more dense and to store more spent fuel in it. He doesn't lose any sleep over it because I think he's a pretty good activist, and he's not guilty about that anymore, but that's one of the things that he designed. And they're doing things like checkerboarding the hot fuel. If you move in the new fuel and you've got some that are a little cooler, you pick up the middle part of that cooler stuff, move that over and put the hot stuff right next to where the cooler stuff is. Maybe you get a little extra time there. But you're also bringing debris in. The so-called crud that gets circulated around in a fuel pool. And you know, this is the kind of thing that the Mark II has. It doesn't have that sense of the white up on top by choice. I think they'll probably, in the next year or so, they'll paint that. They'll take that out there and paint it gray. The condition of that spent fuel that's up on top, which is circulating water 24 hours a day, Bob Alvarez describes it as it's encased, of course, in concrete and a contained metal pool. But that's where it stops. There's no containment on top. It's open. So the building itself is made of materials that you can get in your local auto parts store. It's basically an industrial building, an auto retailer shop. That's the kind of building that it belongs in. And this is 75 feet above the ground. And if something happens, you know, in the sense of what's going on at CGS, we've got, this morning we talked about flooding possibilities, we talked about earthquake possibilities, we talked about emergency planning, and we really have a lot of stuff that needs to be talked about. We've had redacted studies about human terrorism, which I think Paul's going to actually get at some point because they have a study about it and then they haven't told us anything about it. So that's one of our main problems out at CGS. It's a Mark II reactor with a very small containment that's still small. Depends on if there's even a no earthquake, you still have some problems because it's always overheating. There's 150,000 horsepower of heat after you turn that reactor off. The fuel rods go down, control rods go down, and you've still got to get rid of all of that heat that has been boiling water, and you've got to contain that. And that is a serious problem. That's why they have so much water that they've got to circulate all the time. So I'm going to pass this on to Gerry, and then we'll have some questions.
Thanks. This one work? Hi. Thank you, everyone, for organizing this. And
This one. Okay, a little bit better.
oh, that one worked. Thanks, Daniel. So thank you for organizing, and we're going to keep organizing. The discussion of the rat that ate the cables leads me to the first observation. There are a lot of rats in the nuclear industry. Secondly, what do you think that we haven't seen a picture of that rat from Fukushima? Because that rat is actually 6.5 feet tall, has 4 heads, and teeth that glow in the dark. Maybe one of the students will be able to do a Photoshop of the rat that ate the cables at Fukushima. Going to, let's see, the wording is not showing up, so maybe may have to hit these things a couple times. So what I'm going to do is take off a little bit from where Tom Carpenter left off and talk about the relationship with Hanford and the high-level nuclear waste tank leaks, and then come back to what we can do, organizing, and how you can have an impact. So let's just go to the next slide here. And hit it again and again until we get all the words up on this. And let me walk around here. So we've already talked about Hanford has 53 million gallons of high-level nuclear waste in these tanks. And it wasn't news to those of us working on oversight of Hanford cleanup that there were tanks leaking. It was news to everyone else, but it sure wasn't to us. And Tom began to talk about the location of the Columbia Generating Station at Hanford, which is here. And the reality here is one that, as Tom said, they don't want to acknowledge. How many of you testified on the proposal to relicense and give it an extra 20 years of life? Well, the relicensing, okay. So, we were denied an opportunity to hold public hearings around this region. One of the issues that a number of people did raise in their comments is the fact that the reactor sits at Hanford. So, what happens when we have a massive earthquake or other calamity that shuts down electrical power supply? So the Nuclear Regulatory Commission focuses on you're going to get additional electrical support in there or diesel generators that work for 3 days, and then we're going to bring in resources and we'll fix the power supply and the cooling pond will be just fine. Everything is hunky-dory because we're going to bring in all those resources and rewire everything, and it's fine. That might work somewhere else. This is the only reactor, though, where the K basins, I can't quite read it, K basins be right around here, that Tom was talking about. So a spent fuel pool right next to the river filled with crud that if you don't get water in top of it, it catches fire and you have an immediate nuclear calamity right next to the river, plus the fact that the walls will part in a mild earthquake and release radiation into the river. But the calamity for all of eastern Washington, eastern Oregon, Spokane, and further is it won't take hours for that stuff to catch fire. It'll take minutes, and a huge plume would erupt. But that ain't nothing. Because, let's see, where would the B plant be here, Tom? So right here. At Hanford, in what's called the B plant, is the largest concentration on the Earth of stuff that is hotter than spent fuel. It is the extracted strontium and cesium out of spent nuclear fuel rods, put into capsules, and in a 50-year-old swimming pool. And they don't even pretend it has the safety backups of a cooling pond or swimming pool for the commercial reactor. Nowhere close. No pretense about containment. No pretense that it resists a mild earthquake. That thing fails. Water goes down. The first priority is not getting water to the Energy Northwest reactor. Let me tell you, the first priority, which would take days because it's surrounded by high-level nuclear waste tanks, the first priority is getting a water supply back on there because it has far more than one nuclear reactor's worth of radiation, and it is far hotter, and it would literally mean everything in eastern Washington has to be destroyed in terms of crops. Years ago, when we were all fighting the FFTF breeder nuclear reactor being restarted, through the Freedom of Information Act, we got their emergency response plan for what they considered a credible nuclear accident at the FFTF reactor, which is around here. And that emergency response plan was, and I quote, interdict all milk, food, and agricultural produce in eastern Washington and eastern Oregon. That's nothing compared to what happens in a credible earthquake or other natural disaster at Hanford when you add in the Columbia Generating Station. Plus, you've got the high-level nuclear waste tanks. Those tanks are likely to have collapses in a mild earthquake. The dome on these tanks is old carbon steel underneath 20 feet of dirt and gravel, and we don't know how stable and secure those domes are on those high-level waste tanks. Our state, in its infinite stupidity, agreed to give the Energy Department from 2018, when the tanks were supposed to be emptied, until the year 2040 to empty the single-shell tanks in an agreement that was reached just in October 2010. One would think that maybe the state of Washington would be having buyer's remorse about this deal. Now that we know what the watchdog groups were saying is true, that those single-shell tanks were leaking. Let's go to the next slide here. So this kind of just shows a picture of what happens with leaks, schematic. Leaks go down into the ground and spread to the groundwater, and it takes 20 to 50 years to reach the river, is the estimate, depending on where the tank is. If these tanks were leaking already for 10 years, then waste is gone further down into the ground. The state of Washington, the Energy Department, are acting as if we just discovered the leaks. Their news releases and their public statements were, we've got, and I'm quoting from the Energy Department, decades before we have to act. Not true. This is a schematic of one of the high-level nuclear waste tank farms, just from overhead, showing different where 6 tanks are. This is the result of gamma radiation probes being put into holes in the tank farm around the tanks. You just saw, the last slide showed 6 tanks, an overview schematic. Here are 6 tanks. This is the surface level of the ground, and this is the depth down below ground level, and this is where groundwater is flowing. These are showing gamma radiation levels from the probes in the soil, and then doing computer simulation based on that of how far out the radiation spreads, which are leaks from the tanks. If we don't empty these tanks, you can't clean up the leaks. And if we take till the year 2040 to empty the tanks, this is what the leaks look like in 2006. Obviously, you've got a disaster spreading to the Columbia River if you wait until the year 2040 to start getting what's under here. What's so fascinating about this is that from 1996 to 2002, the gamma borehole probes showed in this tank farm an increase in gamma radiation significantly below the tanks, 50-fold increase. And that was, and numerous increases in the boreholes right beneath the tanks, below 50-fold. The only potential conclusion is these tanks were leaking. Now, behind my seat at my Heart of America Northwest office, I have a 30-plus-year-old photograph of the inside of a tank. And in it, you clearly see the rings formed on the top of the crust of the waste from water and liquid. I don't like calling it water because it's contaminated runoff from in the tank farm dripping into the tank steadily. We've known about liquid getting into the tanks for decades and decades. Not something new. We said, your attempt to measure whether or not the tanks were leaking based on putting a probe down here and seeing what the level was is ridiculous. First off, changes with barometric pressure. Secondly, you're not taking into account the stuff that's leaking in. You don't know how much is leaking in, so how do you know if the measurement goes down? And they were going down. They admitted that, but they said, well, it's due to evaporation, et cetera. And they didn't take into account what was coming in, nor did let's go to the next slide. The Energy Department called these tanks stable and continues to call them stable today. Their effort to characterize ignores the monitoring needed around these tanks and instead relies on sticking in probes 4 times a year and seeing what the level change was. And so our state has failed to require state-of-the-art monitoring outside the tank to detect these leaks. And even today, we're not requiring it in the light of this disaster. Many of you also may have commented on the Hanford hazardous waste permit, which there were 2 rounds of hearings on last year, called the RCRA permit. Many of us said, we have the authority to require this, why aren't we requiring it? The state said, we don't need it. They're sticking the probes down and there's no leakage. They've pumped out the pumpable liquid, don't worry. Well, we now know that they were being lied to. And one question is, why hasn't the state said, why didn't you disclose this? You knew last summer. And here's the ringer. Then the state confessed to us, we actually were told last summer that about the first potential leak. And they chose not to disclose it at the public hearings on the Hanford hazardous waste permit when people were out there testifying saying, why aren't you using leak detection? Our state has been complicit in this. Let's keep going. There's a summary here, 50-fold increase, not improper monitoring. The runoff into the tanks has been known. What we need to do is have the waste leaks monitored. We have available technologies to empty some of these tanks and treat some of the wastes for them. Yesterday I was told that the governor is indeed going to have a meeting with the director of ecology and one of the companies that has said that they can treat waste from 11 tanks. On April 10th, we're going to have a meeting The governor did change course from the last 8 years and announced just a week before learning about the first single shell tank leak, the governor said we should be building new double shell tanks and not waiting for the vitrification plant, which is a mere, I don't know, today it's probably $9 billion over budget and a decade away from ever operating if they ever solve the explosive gas and all the criticality problems. So we can do something about this. Now, as a legislator, let me tell you that there are very few people who meet with their legislators. And the most impactful thing you can do is simply, whether it's meeting with a city council member so that they see you face to face and say, why is Seattle an owner and operator of the Columbia Generating Station? Or meeting with legislators and saying, well, how come you voted in the middle of the Fukushima meltdown crisis to pass a resolution supporting relicensing the CGS reactor, which was insane, and saying to them, it's time to change course. We have the ability in our state to replace this energy and create wonderful clean energy jobs with conservation and renewable, and meet our state's renewable energy targets and fit our state's climate change goals. And what it takes is simply, one-on-one meetings with the public utility boards and the city council officials, and asking mayoral candidates. And there are like more mayoral candidates than there are people in this room. So ask them, do you know that you own the Columbia Generating Station? Ask the ones who are on the city council, how come you have never, ever, ever said to Seattle City Light, we should be concerned and voice opposition to having that reactor run for another 20 years. We support shutting it down. Ask them in a crowded room as a candidate, because they can't stand up in front of people in Seattle and say, I'm not concerned, and that we don't want to take responsibility with our vote as an owner of Columbia Generating Station. And the same thing is true at Clark PUD and Snohomish PUD, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so I'll stop here.
Okay, we'll entertain some questions.
Congress has never refused to fund cleanup at Hanford. That's first off. Second off, I have spoken to the state, and we have ways to go on this. The sequestration, where they are actually laying off people emptying tanks, but they are still planning on spending $700 million with no cut on the vitrification plant, despite the fact that in January the General Accounting Office said you should put construction on hold till you solve the safety problems and do the safety testing. We have the money to do the right thing, and lack of money is not an excuse for violating a health, safety, and environmental law. And if they refuse to do it, what happens is that someone gets held in contempt, and that can go all the way up to the Secretary of Energy if he refuses to do it. So it is not, there isn't a lack of money to do the right thing here right now. There isn't a legal excuse where they get to say, Congress didn't give us enough money, given the fact that they can move money from other things, such as the vitrification plants, to do the right thing. And thirdly, frankly, it is the cheaper thing to do is to empty a tank instead of having a leak.
That's one thing. They do have quite a bit of control over that tour. One thing is important is to check out what their schedule and what they're. I'm thinking that they're cutting back on that right now, but we should check that out.
Last year we asked for a special tour, so we had enough people and we made a case, and they did it for us. This was with Alliance for Nuclear Accountability came in, and we got to design the tour pretty much. So that was interesting. But I did do one of those tours, and they took me to the in-reactor area. And we went by what's called the golf ball, which is this big cylindrical facility. It looks like a golf ball. It was silver. And it took liquid waste from the in-reactor that was scoured from the inside the pipes. They would run acid inside these pipes because the alpha would collect on the inside of the pipes. The alpha would react with the pipes and create a neutron. And pretty soon it's too hot to be in the plant for workers. And so they send acid wash through these pipes. It's pretty hot. And it would go into the golf ball every 3 months, and it would fill up. So this golf ball was so hot that it was a no-fly zone over the top of this tank, right? And it had a big berm around it. So we were going through this on this tour, and here's the golf ball in the berm, except there's a gap in the berm where they've taken away some of the dirt, and you can see the golf ball. I said, wait a second, what are you doing? And I had a radiation detector with me, and it went crazy. And they stopped. I said, no, don't stop. And, so they said, what's wrong? I said, you don't even know that there's a huge radiation shine coming through your gap? They go, oh, no, we didn't know that. I said, well, you better know it now. And where's my badge? How much dose did I just get? Right? And then they drove into a parking lot to kind of, and I said, wait a second, my detector's going off again. And sure enough, they parked next to these old sand filters. And I said, look, just take me home. I just want to go home. Thank you very much for the tour. This has been very nice. Okay, so about, 15 or 20 years ago, the Tri-Cities got its way after lobbying and lobbying and lobbying for Department of Ecology to actually establish the Nuclear Waste Program office in the Tri-Cities. And it was a terrible mistake because suddenly there was a lot of people working on the staff there that came from Hanford, who had spouses and brothers and mothers and sisters and kids working at Hanford. And pretty soon, it didn't take long at all before they became a captured regulator. And that's the term that's used, is they quickly become part of the Hanford mentality. They cut them breaks. They're sitting next to, parents at basketball games and soccer games and whatnot. And they're dealing with each other in a community. And so they have looked the other way again and again and again on serious environmental problems that should have been enforced. They don't do it. They say, oh, no, it's in the interest of the cleanup. We don't want to give these guys a hard time. And what they've been sacrificing for all these many years is an operating, quickly opening vitrification facility, the glass plant. And so everything else didn't matter, just the vit plant. So they sacrificed for that, and now the vit plant looks inoperable. It looks like it's not going to work, at least as designed. It's going to be very expensive to change all that, et cetera. And what does the state have left now? So we're hoping, and I don't know if this is a grounded in reality hope or not, that Inslee, our new governor, is going to take a new kind of more strict attitude, regulatory attitude towards Hanford. There are certainly people who want that to happen within the agency itself, who are sick and tired of the complicity and looking the other way. That's been going on for years and years, and it has been going on. I mean, this is something Casey Rood complained about 10 years ago in a very good letter to the Attorney General and the others in the state government. It was ignored. And it's kind of gone on that way. So it's something that the public has to be aware of and fight and insist on of its government, that it's do its job out there. We've been studying this WIP option, and we're against it. So it sounds attractive, but there are numerous problems with this issue. The first is that New Mexico doesn't want it, right? And so you're going to have a political legal fight. The law is against it. There's something called the WIP Withdrawal Act that says, no, we're not going to take high-level waste from Hanford. Hanford's trying to say this is not high-level waste, but all the tank waste is called high-level waste. And that's in a court decision that, they have not rebutted. So they're going to try to make a case that there are several small tanks that don't contain the legal definition of high-level waste. It's not, it's like second or third cycle instead of first cycle reprocessing waste. And however, I've looked at those tanks, they amount to a few thousand gallons. So really, we're gonna build an infrastructure at Hanford to process a few thousand gallons of waste when we've got 56 million, 55 million, the number keeps changing, gallons in these tanks, as opposed to putting the focus on building new tanks. Now also, if they're talking about, oh, we can send remote handled transuranic waste there, they call it true waste. And it sounds like low-level waste, but remote handled means it's so radioactive you can't get near it. It's got to be handled remotely through robotics and cranes and all that stuff. The curie amount in this waste, in the tanks that they have named as candidates to send to WIPP, blows out the entire remote handled inventory for curies at New Mexico, right? So we're about to actually issue a letter on this probably Monday saying don't get fooled by this red herring of trying to send stuff to New Mexico. It's expensive, it's risky, it's politically untenable. It goes against the precepts of the Blue Ribbon Commission that just came out saying the community should want this waste. You know, you should have a dialogue about it. It has got to be compliant with the National Environmental Policy Act. None of this would happen, right? They want to shove it through, right? They're on their 30-day clock, right, to change their priorities in the environmental impact statement to justify this. We didn't even get a chance to comment on this in the EIS. They took it off. They said, we're not going to do this. Now they're changing their minds. I mean, this is just ridiculous. So that answers at least part of your question.
Let me add one thing. When the governor went down and did the tour 2 weeks ago, and Energy announced that they wanted to ship this waste to New Mexico, and the governor said, that sounds great. The ecology department staff hadn't informed the governor's staff that it was currently against the law to do it even. They did not even bother telling them that. Right, there's no, you know, the idea that there'd be some pie in the sky land that wants to take temporary storage of high-level nuclear waste is pie in the sky, and no one's going to step forward. And as many of you may have heard me, you know, presentation after presentation, it's extremely risky, and it will kill people to move the high-level waste, and moving it twice means twice as many die.
You know, it costs money for making those dry casks. It's now I know the campaigns, but what's your estimate of the per cask?
I don't have that. I've heard it's $3 billion for the total for the nuclear industry to move, you know, from the above ground spent fuel pools to dry cask. And not all of it can be, but only the stuff more than 10 years old or 5 years old.
But it is something that we've had a campaign on already at the site. We have people that are skilled at doing that. There's contractors that are out there that are doing it. It is a realistic demand. You know, the person who really initiated that at the DOE at the time was Bob Alvarez. And he said, they asked him, what's most critical around here? And at the time, it was those spent fuel pools that were out cooking along pretty close to the Columbia. They did it, and it was successful. And they just finished this last spring. It was very, you know, it was a completed project. Under budget.
No, okay.
No.
Well, the nuclear industry has argued those with above ground spent fuel pools. Oh, that's unfair to make us do that when the other ones don't. So it's an economic, you know, we're not competitive, blah, blah, blah. It's an economic injustice issue. It's like, wow, really? So anyway, but the NRC has gone with that one and not forced them to dry cast their spent nuclear fuel. And, you know, the cost of doing that versus the cost of cleaning up, you know, is like, there's no comparison. But that's just where our nuclear regulators are right now, is they're pretty servile, of course, to the industry and protective of their
another captured agency.
Well, as to the issue of whistleblowers, Gerry and I actually established a council on the Hanford site called the Hanford Concerns Council. And it was established to mediate whistleblower concerns, worker concerns before they got into the litigation, before people trashed their careers. And this council was pretty interesting because the trade-off was the contractors who employ most of the workers at the site, engineers and welders and carpenters and electricians and whatnot, they get pretty beat up and sometimes fired because whistleblowers come forward and publicize all the bad things they're doing. And there is an opportunity for them to actually act and behave differently. So this council started back in the 1990s in response to a number of very high profile and very ugly cases that went to Congress, that went into the news media and whatnot. And the company said, what can we do? And we were saying, what can we do to help change, some of the culture out there? And for some companies, some of the time, that has worked. So there's been over 100 cases now where people are still working at Hanford in their jobs after having made significant disclosures. The issue that they raised was addressed, their jobs were protected, and they're still in the system. And so for us, that is building a better safety culture to make it off limits for workers to get reprised against or suffer discrimination because they raise safety concerns. We are far from there, and not every contractor participates in this council. So for instance, Bechtel doesn't participate in the council. Bechtel is the contractor building the waste treatment plant, and they just want to go at it. They want to, take us on, take on their own workers. They've got a lousy safety culture, and they're paying the price for that, but so are the whistleblowers, right? And the one good thing I can say is that Donna Bushy went public a year and a half ago with her issues and concerns. She's the manager of nuclear safety out there. And she has been uncompromising in her statements, in her testimony. She has showed up in public. She's given many, many news interviews. And she, by all rights, according to Hanford law, should have been fired years and years ago. I mean, long before today. And she's not having a great, happy existence at work, but she is still there. And she's fighting the good fight and holding her ground. And I really appreciate her for that. And there are a few other people that they're afraid to terminate because to do so would bring the hounds of hell down on their head, and they can't afford to do that. So that's kind of our role. It's not necessarily, making a wonderful existence for these guys, but we are empowering them. We are putting them on Rachel Maddow and talking to USA Today, New York Times, testifying in Congress. And they're making changes at Hanford because they're doing that. And that's what they came forward to do. They knew it was going to be a rough ride to go public with their concerns. It always is. But they wanted to do that even if it was sacrificing their career because they believe in their jobs and their own integrity. We're not talking about promoting nuclear power at the Hanford site. We're talking about a cleanup that threatens the health and safety of the Northwest if it's not done correctly. And a lot of these folks are pro-nuclear, right? I mean, they are, but they're actually starting to change their minds over time when they see the system in its really kind of ugly form, say, no, we're going to sacrifice safety because of the bottom line for cost and schedule and our profits. And that's kind of what's been happening at the waste treatment plant. So we look for those people, we give them protection as best we can, and most of all, though, we empower them and give them a voice.
I guess connecting on that piece of empowering and giving voice, I think that's exactly speaks to your point about the values as a society and what we do. Like, when we think in this room, we all have opinions and we all have ideas and values that we're putting forward, but then we look at what demographic this room represents. And, I would love to see a room where Danny isn't the only young person. I mean, I'm thrilled he's here. I love Danny and I love his energy. I would love to see there'd be an equal number of Dannys in this room. It's also, often just an issue that white people with a fair amount of money talk about too. And so we need to be welcome. We have to bring low-income communities. We have to bring communities of color into these conversations, particularly those communities that bear the burden of these risks so much. And when we think about a society that we value, it's imperative that we have diverse input. I miss a lot of diversity in the conversations. I feel like we have some people's values reflected, and certainly that Holy Trinity you talked about has the most powerful voice, and it's all of our duty to question that voice and show that those values don't represent ours. And whether it be looking at the language and this whole notion of cleanup, there is no cleanup. You can't clean up radiation. So just the idea that we spend all this time and money and effort trying to clean up when the only thing that cleans up is time. Like, you have to wait till that energy dissipates. You can't, all it means is moving it out of the way so we're not getting in contact with it, or shifting it off at somebody, out of sight, out of mind, somebody else's burden, hiding it away, tucking it away. The answer is not using it at all, and becoming just no nuclear at all. I mean, that's really the only option for going forward.
Unhappily, they did some organizing and have both of our senators on board with these small modular reactors. Jay Inslee also signed a statement to that effect. A good number of the state legislators are behind it. And there was, when this was found out, there was an effort to, start push back the number of people who were signing on, which was fairly successful by the time it got to the House, I guess. So they didn't get as many as they had hoped. But it's one of the things that we need to put on our agenda, is telling Jay Inslee and telling the legislator and our decision makers, no, we don't need or want new nuclear technologies at Hanford or anywhere else in the state. It is not a clean, renewable source of energy. The small reactors create waste. They have safety issues, et cetera, et cetera. They're unproven technology. I mean, they shouldn't be there. Tri-Cities is very excited about this. It does have legs. There are a lot of people pushing for it, and they're smart enough to be pushing for it behind the scenes. So from my perspective, I would take the office out of the Tri-Cities. I would leave a skeleton crew there of compliance regulators, but move it back to Olympia and put some distance there. And then I would cycle those folks out in the Tri-Cities. This is what happens in the NRC. There's no such thing as a resident inspector who's around for more than 3 years. They have 3-year tours of duty, and there's very strict rules on fraternization and having dinner with utility executives, et cetera. They can't do it. They don't have any such rules at the Department of Ecology. In fact, there seems to be a lot of intermarrying going on between, it's just something to behold. So I would do that, but given that probably isn't going to happen, because I'm not the governor, simple things they could do is move the permit authority back to Olympia, because they've got a hazardous waste permit that's 8 years, 9 years overdue. They issued it, it was junk. It was really a terrible draft with incomplete sentences and illegal orders in it and all that stuff. So they had to withdraw it, and now they're saying it's going to be another 2 years before they can reissue it. They just don't have the competence at that office or something to accomplish that. So they need to move that function back to Olympia. And the compliance probably ought to be moved back to Olympia as well. And have it come from there so that there's enough distance. You need to replace the leadership at the Department of Ecology and give them new marching orders. And there are some people in particular that Gerry and I would very much love to see put in charge of the United Way campaign and not put in charge of compliance or permit writing.
Inslee has just installed a new ecology chair, right?
But not nuclear waste program.
You know anything about it?
We met with her last Monday, and she seemed like she didn't know much about Hanford, right? So it was trial by fire. She was in her office like 6 days, 6 days into her appointment when Hanford kind of hit the scene, and she was at a press conference looking like a deer in the headlights. And so she is scrambling to come up to speed. She was nice to us. You know, she would listen carefully. What she's going to do, I don't know. Surely she's going to be taking cues from the governor's office.
And luckily, the governor, you know, for instance, Jay Inslee has been the person who we have been bringing these whistleblowers to for how many? 2 decades. I mean, luckily he knows more than the ecology director does. And as I said earlier, he was willing to, even before the first tank leak news hit, he had said, I'm going to change course and agree with what the state of Oregon has been asking for years, which is new double shell tanks, which for the last 8 years, Gregoire refused to support. So that's encouraging. Across the board, not just in the Department of Ecology, but for this, we do face this, an exacerbated problem there. The staffing level, I mean, we pay our state employees like crap. And when you want to have someone who has some expertise overseeing a nuclear and chemical facility, once they get a little bit of training, they are worth 3-4 times in salary what we pay them as state employee. Your state employees had their salaries all cut 3% and haven't had a pay raise. So those folks over in the Tri-Cities who have any competence at all have to sit there and turn down jobs that pay 3-4 times more if they want to do the right thing from the polluter. And that's not something many people stand up and do and say, I want to keep earning $40,000 a year when they're enticing me to leave my job and take a job at $120,000 a year.
And one other point on this, which is that the DOE tells the Department of Ecology what their budget is going to be. And it should be the other way around. It's like, okay, you're the polluter. The polluter has to pay for the oversight. That's the way it goes. And so the regulator needs to tell them what they need, how many staff they need, et cetera, what their budget is, and then the polluter has to come up with that. So they're sent the bill, but that's not how it works in this situation, and so they're beggared. They don't have enough staff at the Department of Ecology. They don't have any, for instance, nuclear engineers. They don't have any chemical engineers. They don't have any system engineers, and they're just run circles around, right? They just don't have a deep enough bench to even know what the heck is going on out there in some cases. They know the RCRA laws, right? Et cetera, kind of. And at least, some things, I mean, there are some folks in there, but man, when it comes to some of the more complicated stuff, it's just not there. So they just need to stand up on their, legs and get a spine and do what they're supposed to do for us, and that's not happening now. Well, the leaks into the river have been going on for decades, and when Gerry and I first started looking at this in the 1980s, in depth, and Tom, Buchanan, a lot of the problems were known then, and there has been a lot of money of taxpayer dollars flowing into Hanford, an average of $2 billion a year for years and years and years and years. And it's very disappointing, the pace of cleanup. And just to be fair, some things have happened. So they've mothballed reactors. They've dug up some of the contamination from around the shore. They've stabilized the K-basins, except for some sludge, which they still need to get. There are some things that you can point to that money has gone to take care of. But the big ticket item of the nuclear waste in the tanks, the high-level waste, nothing has happened with that except you've moved waste from one tank to another. And some of that's necessary. When tanks have leaked, they've tried to get as much liquid out as they can, et cetera. But all of these were temporary stopgap measures, and the permanent solution was supposed to be the waste treatment plant, right? And that is behind schedule, it's over budget, and they built it wrong, and the design sucks. And we hired a contractor who's taken us to the cleaners, You know, I made a little joke here is that, you know, she said there's no cleanup at Hanford. I said the contractors are cleaning up. It's just amazing, really, how much. And then, I don't know if you saw the paper in the last couple of days, but there's been this huge fraud case being brought by the U.S. Attorney's Office, brought by a whistleblower, by the way, on time card fraud, and it's dozens and dozens of employees, and it's their managers. You know, I don't even blame the employees. They're told to work overtime, and then they're sent home after 3 hours, right? But the managers are the ones that sent them home. And they're told to go ahead and you know, claim 8 hours, and now they're in trouble for that. But it's the managers now who are starting to get indicted by the grand juries and whatnot. But you know, this change comes really slowly. If the Department of Energy were a Fortune 500 company, it would be in the top 10 in terms of its wealth and influence. I'm serious. It is a very powerful institution with very powerful contractors behind it. They are very influential in Congress. You know, Gerry and I and Holly, you know, and Tom, we don't have power. Gerry has some power now, but you know, we have influence. You know, we can talk, we can educate, but we just don't have the budgets to get out there and make the changes that need to happen. But we do have the power of truth on our side, you know, and we can get the word out, and we've been very successful in getting the word out. So I think that's been useful, and sooner or later, there will be attention riveted on Hanford in a very big way. It's starting to happen with the tank leaks. Whether that keeps going, I don't know. But I have a feeling Congress is getting sick and tired of hearing nothing but bad news. And I sense an opportunity to strike to make some changes, systemic changes, in how Hanford is run.
Yeah, they're saying 30 years it will be completely submerged.
30?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's already leaching plutonium they're finding it in the shellfish, and they're finding it in the coral around the facility. It was built in the 1970s by the U.S. Defense Nuclear Agency, which is an agency that was abolished, and transfer for responsibility for that facility didn't go anywhere else. And so it ultimately went to the Marshallese, and the U.S. said, okay, now you own this. It's in your country. You're responsible for it. And so, you know, there are no structural engineers in the Marshall Islands. There are no health physicists. There's no money to monitor the facility at all. And so the Marshallese just inherited that as some of the nuclear colonialism, the nuclear legacy.
Do I recall there are about 90,000 residents of the whole complex?
The Marshall Islands, about 55,000 people. You're probably thinking there's a quote by Kissinger, and he said, there are only 90,000 people out there, who gives a damn? And that was the reason why they looked to Micronesia as the area to test in the first place. Yeah.